And today, while I was watching the film, I was thinking about gender, and I was also thinking about it in terms of genre and how those two things interact. How war movies are very much a male genre and very much a certain kind of male storytelling about violence and identity and group and so on. But I guess that's related to what I'm going to talk about now, but not that closely. So the title of the talk is Imagine There's No China, Wei Te-Sheng's Japan Trilogy. And from the title right there, you get an idea of what I think is the kind of part of the explanation for this phenomenon that happened around 10 years ago with these films. I briefly introduced Wei Te-Sheng to you this morning, and also Seediq Bale and Cape No.7, which we'll see tomorrow. And then he also produced a third film. He didn't direct it, but Umin Boya, who's one of the actors, the actor I think who plays it's either the one who plays the young Mona Rudar or the actor who plays Temu Wallace, I forgot which one, sorry, in Seediq Bale, directed Kano in 2014. And that was also a big box office hit in Taiwan. That third film, Kano, is a triumph of the underdog sports film about a baseball team from southern Taiwan that makes it to the finals in Tokyo, also during the Japanese colonial era. And another male group film, if you like, which there's an element of that tomorrow. But interestingly, the musical band tomorrow has got a girl in it, so it's a bit different. Anyway, these three films, as a result of their shared connection to Japan and the Japanese colonial era, are often referred to as Wei Te-Sheng's Japan Trilogy. Seediq Bale, of course, not only a Japanese colonial era film, but a film all about the Seediq indigenous people. I already mentioned this morning the debate about whether Taiwan is the place where all the Austronesian peoples originated from, or whether people came from elsewhere in the South Pacific to Taiwan. There's a lot of discussion about that. But there are significant indigenous characters also in Cape No.7 and in Kano, because some of the members of the baseball team are indigenous Taiwanese. So that's another issue that links all of the films. And I'm just realizing I haven't put the microphone on, so I'm going to stick it on now. Sorry about that. Always something one forgets. So it's this combination of box office success, the Japanese colonial era, and indigeneity that I'm interested in focusing on today. In Taiwan, it used to be common to say that older people who had nostalgic memories of the half-century of Japanese colonization had a so-called Japan complex. So it's interesting to ask why the Japanese colonial era has been so appealing in recent Taiwanese cinema, because in fact Wei Te-Sheng's films are not the only ones that have a kind of focus on this period, especially when today so very few Taiwanese have any direct memories of the Japanese colonial era. In fact, one might argue not having any direct memories makes it easier to have positive feelings, because being colonized, as this film, the one we've just seen, certainly shows is not something to be romanticized. And also, why is it that indigeneity, which was once very heavily marginalized, indeed something that people used to deny, now very popular in Taiwan? And I want to argue that perhaps a key to understanding these phenomena is really Taiwan's relationship to China, to the People's Republic. And I'll try and explain why as I go through the talk. I will just offer a little anecdote at this point, forgive me. But when I first went to Taipei, I'd lived in Beijing for a number of years, where it was hard to find anyone who had anything positive to say about Japan. And I worked for China Film Corporation. Now you'll know in those days, people were assigned their jobs, so they didn't choose them. So the guy who was the Japanese translator in China Film Corporation had been told, you're going to learn Japanese, and you're going to be he hated Japanese people. Whenever a Japanese delegation came from Tokyo, he would call in sick so that they couldn't translate. He was so anti-Japanese. So I go to Taipei for the first time. This is before the Taipei metro exists. And I have to take a taxi across town. And you know how bad traffic used to be in Taipei in those days. And I took the taxi, and the taxi driver was a very, very old man. And the minute he realized I could speak Mandarin, in fact, my Mandarin was, I think, slightly better than his, he just started in on how he hated the KMT and how fantastic the Japanese were and how much he wished the Japanese were still there. And I just couldn't believe it, right? I just couldn't believe it. I was so shocked. So that's the Japan complex, okay? But, some people have accused Wei Te-Sheng of perpetuating the Japan complex. And I think it's a really interesting question to think about, whether that's the case or not. Now, first, what I'd like to do is just talk a little bit about these films, however, as corrective films, both in relation to the Japanese colonial era and in relation to indigeneity. And of course, this idea of the corrective narrative marks ideological changes in values. I'm not saying that the films are or are not true in any kind of absolute sense, but what I'm saying is that the feeling of a need to correct is a manifestation of a change in values and beliefs. And the fact that the films were also big hits in Taiwan indicates that the kind of changes the films propose were accepted by a very large proportion of the audience at the time. So first, how are these films correcting the narrative of the Japanese colonial era? Taking Kano first, it's a film about correcting low Japanese expectations of Taiwanese sports teams. And therefore, by extension, it's about correcting a broader tendency of the colonizer, Japan, to look down on the colonized Taiwan. And that is the narrative of the film, that nobody expects this baseball team to be able to make it into the finals and to get to Tokyo and to almost win. So it's also perhaps by extension a critique of Taiwanese low self-esteem. And we were talking at lunchtime about the idea of the Taike spirit. And that idea of the Taike is the idea of Taiwanese as lovable losers. And so in some sense you could say this is and also Seediq Bale, I think, is a kind of criticism of that spirit. Now with Seediq Bale, it's a very interesting kind of correction of, first of all, older Japanese narratives of indigenous Taiwanese as eager supporters of the Japanese empire. There are many different narratives of this type, but in the film world, these narratives are exemplified by the most famous film shot on Taiwan during the Japanese colonial era. I should explain that during that era, there was no local production industry. So there were Japanese filmmakers who came and shot films in Taiwan, and some local Taiwanese were using home movie cameras like Liu Na-o was making home movies at that time. But the film Scion's Bell was directed in 1943 by a very famous Japanese director, Shimizu Hiroshi, and it stars Li Xianglan, who's also known as Yamaguchi Yoshiko, in the title role of the Aboriginal girl, Scion. Now, the whole story of Yamaguchi Yoshiko, Li Xianglan, Rikoran, Shirley Yamaguchi, as she became later, is a whole interesting other story. And you can ask me in the questions if you want to hear it. But this is a woman who transforms herself repeatedly, but she was discovered in Manchuria, as it was, in Manchukuo, as it was then, the Japanese colony, and promoted as an ethnically Chinese loyal citizen of the Japanese Empire, who was known for her very beautiful voice. Initially she was just on radio. And she plays in this film, she plays Scion, who was a real figure, and allegedly was a young indigenous woman so devoted to the Japanese Empire that she sacrificed her own life, leading recruits to the Imperial Army down from the mountains in a storm. And she slips, but she's carrying their suitcases for them on her shoulder, and she slips in the storm and dies. There really was a memorial bell built to her and in her hometown. And the film, starring Yamaguchi Yoshiko, was made as a narrative to tell this story. Seediq Bale obviously corrects this kind of focus on allegedly submissive indigenous women under Japanese rule, replacing it with a focus instead on male warriors and resistance. And that's part of the whole gender dimension that interests me. Wu Jiarong argues that the film reveals the destructive cultural impact of the Japanese policy of assimilation. For example, by blocking the passage to manhood, by banning the headhunting right that was the passage for young men. And we see that as set out very clearly in the first part of the film that we watched today. Also, from an eco-critical perspective, Li Jinqing argues that the film corrects the Japanese vision of Taiwan as a landscape to be exploited by revealing it instead as a place of belonging for the Seediq. And the film provoked a lot of debate in Taiwan about the Japanese colonial era and how it should be seen. And you can, as well as those two articles that I've put up there, there's a host of writing in Chinese as well around the film. You're going to see Cape No.7 tomorrow, so I apologize right now for a few plot spoilers. I'm sure you four have all seen it before, but anyway, you haven't seen it. Okay, so stick your fingers in your ear if you don't want to hear the plot spoilers. But I don't think I'm giving away very much. The film oscillates between a contemporary love story about a Taiwanese man and a Japanese woman, and a historical romance about a Japanese male teacher and the Taiwanese girl student and lover that he left behind when he was repatriated to Japan at the end of the war. So this narrative can also be seen as corrective from a patriarchal perspective, where it becomes a male Taiwanese and a female Japanese in the contemporary setting, replacing the colonial male power and feminized Taiwan of the historical narrative. And without giving away too much, I will just say that the way the contemporary love story ends is also very different. And it's also different in the obvious sense that their love survives, but also in the some not so obvious ways we can talk about after we've seen the film tomorrow. Now, even though they're corrective narratives I would argue that each film also still has elements of the Japan complex. If this idea of a Japan complex, means a love and respect for the former colonizer, all three films continue to have elements of that. First, as you'll see tomorrow, Cape No.7 is very obviously a Japan-Taiwan love story and full of nostalgic elements. Some critics have even felt that the film conveys a regret that the Japanese had to leave at the end of the war, because this meant he had to abandon this Taiwanese girl that he was in love with. And you can make your own mind up about that when you see the film tomorrow, of course. As for Kano, it's very obviously about a search for respect from Japan. Okay. First, the coach of the baseball team, who you can see here, is Japanese. And so, in a way, the film is all about the team trying to win the respect of their Japanese coach. On the slide there, you have the Japanese poster, and I think it's no accident that the Japanese poster emphasizes the Japanese actor who plays plays the coach in the film. So when the posters that promoted the film in Taiwan, he's also in the center of those, but the rest of the team are there as well. So he's a much smaller figure. But in this case, he dominates the poster completely, as you can see. He's a kind of father figure. They have to prove themselves to him. And then they also want to win in the Japanese league, play the Japanese game, and get the respect of the Japanese audience. In the case of Seediq Bale, in the whole 5 hours, the scene that I personally find most interesting is that scene at the end where the two Japanese soldiers are discussing, and the old guy, the one who started out saying they're just a bunch of savages, they're not capable of organized fighting, planned campaign against us, has to express admiration for the indigenous warriors who fought back as possessing the true Bushido spirit of the samurai that allegedly had been lost with modernization. So again, it's as though the highest thing that the film can imagine achieving for warriors is the Bushido spirit, the Japanese spirit. That's, I think, kind of interesting too. It's remarkable for a few reasons, actually. First of all, there's no narrative reason for the existence of this scene at all, right? You don't need it to understand the story. You've got the idea that they're great warriors. Why is it necessary to tell us they've got Bushido spirit? So that's interesting that gets added in. And second, it also suggests that indigenous Taiwanese are the true Japanese in the modern era, which is itself a kind of bizarre claim, it seems to me. And that these Japanese values, as I mentioned, are the supreme values to aspire to. So even though Seediq Bale is unquestionably very, very critical of Japanese colonialism, that scene seems to be a very different kind of a scene to me. In addition to the Japan complex, the other important characteristic that all three films share is the inclusion of indigenous characters. Seediq Bale is all about indigenous people. Kano has a multi-ethnic composition of the baseball team. And in the case of Cape No.7, you've got this musical band, and I've really struggled to find a picture that just had the musical band in it, okay? Interestingly, with Cape No.7, nearly all the promotion of the film emphasized the rom-com, okay? But actually there's a double narrative, and the formation of the band is as big a part of the narrative as the rom-com. At the risk of a slight digression, I just want to mention that when they did research about the film and its popularity after its huge success, especially in the south of the island, they interviewed people and asked them, what did they like about the film and so on. And actually, it wasn't the rom-com that attracted the audience so much. It was more this musical band narrative. And the musical band, of course, they are a bit taika, this lovable loser types, and we'll see this tomorrow. But there are, in fact, two members of the band who are indigenous. And one of them is the guy on the bottom left there who's doing this, and his father, who for some reason is not in this picture. I'm not sure why. And I tried to find one with both of them in, but I couldn't. So in addition, and I want to mention that in addition to, the story very much emphasizes the idea of a multi-ethnic composition of the population in both Kano and in Cape No.7. Kano, because as well as indigenous Taiwanese, there are the Hoklo or Minnanhua speaking Taiwanese and also Japanese members of the team, ethnically Japanese members. In the case of the musical band, there's also Hakka people, a Hakka member of the team. I think you all know who the Hakka are. Sometimes, because they're not traced back to a particular region or place in mainland China, sometimes an analogy is made or a comparison between the Hakka, who are literally the guest people, the Kerjaren, with Romanis in Europe. This strong presence of indigenous characters in these films is the culmination of changing representations of indigenous people in Taiwanese cinema. And it's part of a larger transformation in indigenous culture and attitudes towards indigenous culture by non-indigenous Taiwanese, I think. And I think it's also can be understood as corrective. So in the Japanese colonial era, in films like Sion's Bell, which I mentioned a few years ago, indigenous people were a sort of symbol of Taiwan. They were visible evidence of its difference from Japan. But they were also evidence, or used as evidence, for a narrative of primitiveness, a notion that then provided the justification for colonization in the name of bringing civilization. And I think you can see Seediq Bale very much as a critique of that, especially again in the early parts of the film. During the KMT nationalist martial law era that stretched for over 40 years, from the late 40s to the late 1980s, there were also films about indigenous Taiwanese. And these tended to emphasize the idea of assimilation. They often featured indigenous women who married Chinese men, ethnically Chinese men, like in this particular film, which is translated into English as the Second Spring of Lao Mo. Lao Mo is somebody who has come over from the mainland, a low-ranked KMT soldier, very poor, and he marries an indigenous bride. This emphasis, and she then becomes heavily sinicized. So this idea that by intermarriage and sinicization, assimilation will occur, is in fact, of course, in line with the larger policies of the KMT, who, like the Chinese Communist Party, used to insist that Taiwan was simply a Chinese province. And so, as well as emphasizing assimilation for indigenous Taiwanese, who were supposed to become completely Chinese, they also emphasized re-sinicization for other islanders, who were encouraged to not only stop using Japanese names and so on, which they might have had from if they were part of the older generation, but also to stop speaking Minnanhua in public. I think you were at one point, you got fined if you used Minnanhua in school, for example, and in courtrooms and so on. And you were supposed to move over to Mandarin as quickly as possible, which, as you all know, was declared the national language of China, which for the KMT meant the whole of China, including Taiwan from their point of view. Now, of course, local Minnan-Hua speakers never stopped speaking Minnan-Hua at home or amongst themselves. But for many indigenous Taiwanese, from what I understand, and I'm curious to hear more later, the pressure was a great deal stronger. There was a strong stigma attached to being indigenous, and given that numbers of indigenous people are quite small, many people started to speak Mandarin and to pass as Chinese rather than as indigenous. As a result, a couple of generations grew up speaking Mandarin mostly, or Minnan-Hua as well, rather than the indigenous languages. And in some cases, the older generations hid their indigenous roots from their children and from their grandchildren. So this, in other words, was a process of what we would call cultural genocide perpetrated by the KMT at that time. Since the end of martial law in 1987 and the development of multi-party democracy, space has emerged for various kinds of different communities in Taiwan. So Taiwan has become, if you like, a sort of multi-community society. Indigenous people have been both making their own films, especially documentaries, and appearing more and more frequently in feature films. One of those films, which of course I'm blanking on the name of the director right now, but interestingly, in at least one of those films, there is some very interesting scenes in which the director talks to his parents about, why did you bring me up as Chinese? Why did you not want to reveal that you were indigenous? And the father uses that term fanren, that you saw being used in Seediq Bale. Say, well, how could I tell you that we were fanren, that we were savages, right? So this is something that is very emotional to think about it, is being brought to the fore more and more as people recover indigenous culture and identity. And in some cases, people are recovering indigenous names. So I've given you one example there are many others. Kolas Yotaka, is an Amis woman who previously served as President Tsai Ing-wen's spokesperson. She's now running for office herself, I think as the mayor of Hualien. I've forgotten exactly which position she's going for. She was brought up as Ye Guanling, and interestingly, she chooses to write her name in the Roman alphabet rather than in Chinese characters. So this is, again, part of this recovery process. And as you can see, there's so much video activism going on. The Taiwan Studies Centre at ZOAS in London held their annual film work entirely on indigenous films and filmmakers this year. In regard to indigenous culture, I think something, jumped ahead there. One thing that's significant about Wei Te-Sheng's films is that they were embraced by audiences all across the island and not only indigenous Taiwanese. And of course, there are many controversies and debates about how the Seediq were depicted in the film. And if you're interested in that, I was reading some of the articles in this collection of essays called The Musha Incident, edited by Michael Berry, who's not any relation to me. It's pure coincidence we have the last name. It's not my little brother or something, right? In this book, there's a series of essays that are not specifically about the film, but deal with many of the debates around the film and debates about the Musha incident itself. And it's quite an interesting read. I've just been tearing through it as quickly as I can. In the Japanese colonial era, jumped a little bit. So popular with audiences all across the island. So overall, I think what we can see happening is that indigeneity is emerging again as symbolizing Taiwanese identity, as it did during the Japanese colonial era. But in the Japanese colonial era, it was a symbol of Taiwanese exoticness, seen through the eyes of the colonizer. And today it's being embraced as a symbol of selfhood for many Taiwanese, even for those who have few or no actual indigenous roots. I think this is a very complicated issue we can talk about a bit more later. Taken as a group, we see the Seediq as historical ancestors in Seediq Bale, and the indigenous Taiwanese as they are also key members of the multi-ethnic mix in both Cape No.7 and Kano. The idea of adopting indigenous culture as one's own is there in Kano No.7 in a detail I want to draw your attention to now. In her efforts to bring the group, the musical band together, who don't gel very easily as a musical band, let's just say, the young Japanese woman who is their manager buys indigenous bead necklaces for each of them and gives them each a necklace and says, this one symbolizes this, and this is why I'm giving it to you, and so on. So if the band represents, in some sense, modern Taiwan, then the beads suggest that indigenous culture is something that they can embrace and can hold modern Taiwanese together. Now, I would like to, need to speed up a bit, but I'd like to explore this embrace of indigeneity as part of Taiwanese identity, and also the Japanese colonial era as a key period in Taiwanese history. I'd like to explore this a bit further. Why does this occur about a decade ago? Why didn't it occur a lot earlier? I think if we go back to the last decades of the previous century, the era of democratization and the admission of the Greens or the Independence Party into politics, it became possible to imagine from the late 1980s on the Japanese colonial era and the indigenous Taiwanese quite differently from the ways that they were promoted by the KMT during the martial law era, as I've mentioned those a bit earlier. But nothing like the Wei Te-Sheng phenomenon happened in the 1980s or the 1990s. And I don't think it's a coincidence that the economy of the People's Republic of China was only just beginning to open up and marketize and grow back then. Back then, Taiwan seemed much more advanced. I mean, this is a very ideologically loaded term itself, but it seemed much more advanced than the People's Republic, which looked to Taiwan for investment back then. But since then, as we all know, that's all changed. And now it's the People's Republic economy that is many times huger than that of Taiwan. And also the Taiwanese economy is completely enmeshed with that of China. The People's Republic has always agreed with that old KMT position that Taiwan is part of China. But until recently, there didn't seem to be any imminent possibility that a successful invasion could ever happen. By the time of Seediq Bale, the People's Republic and its claims over Taiwan were beginning to loom large. They were beginning to be felt. But at the same time, fewer and fewer Taiwanese were identifying as Chinese or as part of a big Chinese family. Around this time, a bit earlier, I was teaching in Berkeley. I used to teach there before I went back to the UK. And I taught a Chinese cinemas plural class every year, right? One year I taught it, you get student evaluations, and I got criticized by the Taiwanese students for not including enough Taiwanese films. They felt there should be more of them. So I put more of them in. The next year, before I could even begin my lectures, in the middle of the classroom, a Taiwanese student or somebody of Taiwanese background stood up and denounced me for showing any Taiwanese films in a Chinese cinemas class because Taiwan is not China, right? So this is, again, an example of something, a very fraught issue. I didn't mind him saying that, by the way, it's fine. But, it just shows you how strong some people are about rejecting that whole idea of a China connection. So it's in these circumstances of rising anxiety combined with a rising sense of local Taiwanese identity that I think the Japanese colonial era and indigenous Taiwanese culture both come to hold a special appeal. What accounts for that special appeal? First and most evidently, Taiwan's long and transformative experience as a Japanese colony and its indigenous population are unique to it and not shared by the People's Republic. The People's Republic was invaded by Japan, and different parts of it were occupied by different periods of time, for different periods of time, but the country was not turned into a 50-year-long Japanese colony, as was the case with Taiwan. And as a result, Japanese culture became embedded into Taiwan's culture in ways that are simply not present in the PRC. The whole cherry blossom thing in this film, by the way, in Seediq Bale was just seen as a very Japanese thing, right? But everyone in Taiwan knows what it means, which is very interesting. In regard to indigeneity, the PRC's understanding of the issue is quite special. On the one hand, the People's Republic of China was one of the very early supporters and adopters of the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, passed in 2007. And it sees itself as a multi-ethnic state composed of 56 peoples, but it denies that it has any indigenous people. And why? Because it sees indigeneity as an issue that is related specifically to the legacy of colonialism. And it doesn't see China as a colonial power, okay? It doesn't recognize itself as having any colonial issues. Of course, this is, again, a hugely controversial issue internationally, not in China itself. But therefore, indigeneity in Taiwan, indigeneity becomes another marker of Taiwanese difference, along with the Japanese colonial era, things that they don't share with the PRC. Therefore, these elements, the Japanese colonial era, indigenous Taiwanese, are appealing signifiers of Taiwan's unique identity. Furthermore, turning to events like the Wusha incident or the Musha incident is also a way of retelling a national or quasi-national foundation myth. Now, I don't have time to go into the differences between pre-modern societies and the modern nation state in much detail, but if you're interested, Benedict Anderson's work on imagined communities is a great starting point. And one crucial difference is that empires and monarchies don't care about shared identity. What they want is allegiance. It didn't matter to the Romans what language you spoke at home or what ethnicity you were. You didn't have to think of yourself as Roman. You just had to be a loyal subject of the Roman Empire. But the modern nation state depends on the idea that we're citizens and that we are the agents who are in charge of it, this society, and that we have some sort of shared identity. To construct that shared identity, narratives are told, national foundation myths. Of course, the KMT made films that emphasized the idea that everyone was a child of the Yellow Emperor, as the title of a 1956 film puts it. This emphasizes Chineseness. They also made their own version of the Opium War story, which marks the idea of the beginning of modern China back to a moment of humiliation. This is this idea of the logic of the wound that Ray Chow calls it, that you narrate from a low point so you can narrate a story of progress, of recovery, of getting back your nation state. I said earlier this morning, the English do it with 1066 and the French invasion, our old enemy of thousands of years or whatever, right? So in the case of post-KMT Taiwan, going back to the Musha incident depicted in Seediq Bale can also be understood as this kind of logic of the wound of telling Taiwan's history. But unlike the Opium War or the Yellow Emperor, this is a history that is unique to Taiwan and to the island of Taiwan. So I would argue that Wei Te-Sheng's so-called Japan trilogy is in fact his Taiwan trilogy, and he caught the right moment when the Taiwanese audience was ready for a new foundation myth. How indigenous Taiwanese feel about that, their histories being appropriated for that purpose, I don't know. I do know a bit. I know that it's again, a subject of controversy. Furthermore, immersing oneself in films set in the Japanese colonial era or focused on indigenous people is a way of not having to think about China. In this regard, I think it's quite important that almost everyone going to see these films has no direct memory of the Japanese colonial era and the racism and exploitation that were part of it. And the vast majority of them are also not indigenous and have no direct experience of the difficulties of being indigenous in Taiwan. Therefore, they spend a few hours safely in the cinema, distracting themselves from their anxieties and imagining a world where there is no China, right? In these 5 hours, China is a long way away and forgotten. More recently, of course, the visit of Nancy Pelosi and the military exercises that have followed have made it clear that it's very, very difficult to forget about China at the moment in Taiwan. And the pressure is higher than ever before. I think to this day, the impossibility of imagining a solution to the relationship with China means that films that allow audiences to forget about these intractable problems have continued to be popular. If you look through the films that have been popular in recent years, the Taiwanese films, they're often films that enable you to at least forget about China for a while. But maybe it's not possible in the light of the contemporary high pressures to match the kind of success that Wei Te-Sheng had with this trilogy at that particular moment. Thank you very much.